Jews for Justice for Palestinians. Please, for Glenn Secker.
Thank you. I thought I knew it all. I knew about the 20 villages massacred in 1948, the 20 Stern gangs. I knew about Sabra and Shatila and Karsled and Pillars of Defence and autumn mists and summer rains and the dreadful occurrences now. Brothers Keeper and Protective Edge and Sojar and Rafah. I didn't think there were any more horrors to know about. And just incredibly the other day I learned about another one. I learned of the labour camps during the Nakba, where the Israeli forces took Palestinians into labour camps, forced them into breaking stones, probably the stones from their demolished houses, to build roads. Didn't feed them properly, didn't provide them with medical care. If they resisted, they were shot. This was in 1948. 3 years after 1945, when the Second World War came to an end, when Jews who had been in the labour camps and the extermination camps were liberated. How incredible is that? From 1948 until 1967, there was a brief interregnum in Israel, a period of what's called liberal Zionism. When Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982, the Peace Now movement was able to bring out, in protest of that invasion, 450,000 people on the streets. But where are they now? The last demonstration was about 7,000. What's happened is the people who committed those atrocities in 1948, the Stern Gang and the Irgun Gang and the Palmach unit of the army, they're back in the driving seat now. What was important about that interregnum period, it was when Israel established itself in the West as a normal, quote, democracy. It established its universities, it established a liberal and a progressive face. Many students from universities here going off on kibbutz experiences, coming back, wondering, that's a nice place to live, how wonderful it was. I didn't realise, like me, when I went out there, that the water that filled the swimming pool had been stolen from Palestinian villages next door. That although they said they shared all the dirty work, when you asked who was the guy doing the washing up, they said, I don't care about him, he's Palestinian. But it was an important period in British history in respect to Palestine and in respect to Israel, because it established Israel as a normal, quote, democracy with a good face, and it's helped build its impregnability now. The way people here are frightened of criticising Israel. But as I say, the Stern Gang and the Irgun descendants are now back in the driving seat, in government, in the settlers, in the armed forces. They're out on the streets, they're threatening and beating up Palestinians and threatening their employers and forcing Jews who don't agree to shout out in the streets, kill Arabs. And I wasn't sure whether this was an accurate report. So I called up some friends in Israel, some people who have been on the Jewish boat to Gaza with me shortly after the Mavi Marmara. And I called up Rami, who was on the boat, and he was there because his daughter had died in a suicide bombing in Jerusalem. And his response to that was to join an organisation called Bereaved Families Circle. Him and his wife knew it. And they said, the only answer is for us to talk. The only answer is justice for Palestinians. Now I've got two children. I don't know if one of my children had died like that, whether I would have had the depth of personality to do that. So he's a beacon for me. He's a shining beacon. And I called him up, and I called up also Itamar Shapira, who was also on the boat, who used to be a captain in the army in Israel and came out of the army on grounds of conscience, because when he saw what he had to do, he refused to do it, and he joined the Refuseniks, and they're building that opposition within Israel. And I asked them, is this true? Is it really like this on the streets with these descendants of the Stern Gang and the Ergun Gang? These gangs which actually were by the people who became the leaders of Israel, Golda Meir and Ben Gurion and that lot. And I said, is it really like that now? And Rami said, yes, I'm ashamed to say it is. And my only reply to him was, you should feel no shame, because it's not in your name, it's not in our name. Israel is not what it's doing in any sense of the word in our names. Now, the beheading of the United States journalist was awful, but it's being manipulated and used by the media and by the government to whip up Islamophobia, to rip up a deep racism towards Muslims and towards Arabs, and it's despicable. And Obama and Cameron and the press here actually need to remove the beam that's in their eye. They talk about, yes, they report 2,000 deaths of Palestinians in Gaza. They talk about 450 deaths of children. They talk about 10,000 injuries. But that's all they do. They don't describe it in its horror, in its lucid horror, in the way in which they talk about this American journalist. They actually refer to it in a way that anonymizes it and makes it anodyne. They don't refer to the person who had to carry his child in bits home in a polythene bag from the butchers of hell. They don't talk about the mutilated injuries, the charred bodies, the fragmented bits of people that people have to search in the rubble of their homes for so they can gather their remains and bury them. The pictures of this incredible consequence, of this unbelievable behaviour by Israel, are banned from the media in Israel. They've brought in regulation which means no one can see the results of what they're doing. And I think it's because they think that even the 75% of Israelis who support them won't have the stomach to see the consequences of their action. Even here, the reporting is muted. We put up some of the lucid, the accurate results on our Facebook page, and Facebook page was taken down by Facebook. There have been decades of brutal regimes in the regime, backed by this country, backed by France, backed by America, traded with by the big corporations. Israel has been an integral part of that. Once somebody asked President Nixon, why do you give so much money to Israel? And he said, it's simple. It's a fraction of the money we spend on the 6th Fleet. It's a key part of Western control of that whole economic and political arena that is North Africa and the Middle East. Mainly because of the oil, mainly because of the oil revenues, and also because it's a big market, a big arms market, £80 billion contract to Saudi Arabia recently. And Israel is a key component of that. It was a key component of the coup in Egypt. It brought in Sisi, re-established a military dictatorship. There can be no surprise then if people deny civil rights, human rights, facing the horrendous actions of military police, if they turn themselves to a forceful and a violent reaction. The Palestinian struggle in the Middle East has always been the centre of the whole of the struggle for liberty in the Middle East. It's very simple to end the disaster, just to give human and civil rights and justice to the Palestinians. We must institute an arms embargo on Israel. We must end the blockade on Gaza. We must insist.
Yes! Yeah! Yeah!
And we will, because because of the power of the development of the boycott and divestment and sanctions movement, we will achieve justice for Palestinians.